owners stay-at-home mandates, but they are not exempted from the CDC guidelines. Your POA board and staff are charged with continuing and will not be summoned until the previous presenter is left. We are disinfecting the speaker's table and microphone after each presentation. We've taken special care to try to protect participants in today's meeting while making sure that you, the residents and property owners of Telco Village, are able to observe our proceedings. With that, I'll open the meeting by calling for a motion to approve the minutes from the March 18th meeting.
I make the motion to approve.
Pat made the motion and Marty Eaton seconded.
No, his name is Bruce Johnson.
Do we have any changes to the minutes? Steve?
I gave my two adjustments to Mid-C. One has to do with I requested Winston do a complete review of spare part inventory of the water and sewer system in case there's a disruption in the supply chain. And I also requested that Winston prepare a contingency plan.
Any other changes to the minutes? Okay, with that, all in favor of adopting the minutes with the changes, raise your right hand. Everyone, I was muted, I'm sorry. A show of right hands for approving the minutes as amended. 7-0. We'll move on to the next item, which is the ratification of an electronic vote taken by the board earlier this month on March 31st. And the motion is to ratify the board's action on March 31st, 2020 by 7-0 electronic vote to suspend recreation fee monthly billings and to extend annual and semi-annual memberships by the amount of time that recreation department facilities are closed due to COVID-19. Do I have that motion?
Yeah, I'll make the motion, but to clarify, we're doing this because we've already taken the electronic vote, and this formalizes or ratifies that. So that is the motion I'm making, what we've already adopted.
I have a second. Sue, you seconded. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, right hand. 7-0. That brings us to the next agenda item, which is the COVID-19 update presented by Winston Blazer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Update on this POA operations in respect to COVID-19. The administration offices are closed at this time for walk-up business. Most staffers are in the office there to take phone calls and are doing administrative work and performing their jobs like paying bills, etc. The Welcome Center lobby is closed to walk-ins. The staff is there working on administrative marketing functions, communications functions, and they are taking calls and working through the window to for any dissemination of marketing materials for the brave souls that come down to visit Telco Village. Generally, those come down and are meeting with a realtor and looking at moving into Telco Village.
They can't hear you, Winston, Steve, and the gang.
Oh, that was intentional, but thank you.
I turned my camera off for a second.
Okay, you guys good? They're eating. They don't care what I'm saying.
Now we can hear you.
The golf is in full bore. For the one exception is the pro shops are not open for walk-in business. They are booking tee times and trying to sell merchandise electronically and keeping social distancing in mind at all time. The golf course staff would like for me to encourage all to support the golf merchandising operation. But as far as golf play goes, so far, the numbers for March look good, and the rounds for the first week of April are right in line with the budget amount. So golf is percolating right along. The rec department, on the other hand, is basically closed down. Rec facilities, courts are all closed. We're doing that for the safety and prevent the spread of this COVID-19 virus. The rec management team is working, though, behind the scenes to maintain the buildings, maintain pool status, getting to some projects that were, on the to-do list, but were hard to get to when they were in full swing. And also, there's been a little work, maintenance done on the rec trails. Food service in Tellico Village is shut down. We have the takeout order and delivery service at the Yacht Club and the Kahiti locations. The numbers are not where I'd like for them to be. I'd like for more of the villagers to support the Yacht Club food service operation. That would minimize the financial impact on our total POA operation somewhat. They have a menu that combines both items from the Toqua and Tanasi clubhouse operations, along with some food products here at the Yacht Club. So it's a limited menu, but pretty broad given the circumstances. Public Works is operating, but with a very limited staff, so therefore a lot of the maintenance functions and service functions that are normally provided in the POA are being operated on a minimal basis, and we are keeping the utilities and the streets and the safety as priorities for the Public Works operations here in Tellico Village. If you have any questions or concerns or issues, please contact the admin office, the ACC office, golf course, rec center. All of these operations are still taking calls and answering questions. And a lot of staffs are behind the scenes. We're just trying to eliminate the public contact. And that concludes my report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Winston. Are there any questions for Winston? Carla? Can't hear her.
Vacation. We had some property owners who were asking questions about not being able to use the tennis courts. And I just wondered if you could clarify the reason those tennis courts are closed.
Didn't hear
The question was, can we clarify why we closed the tennis ball courts?
the tennis and pickleball courts versus the golf course operations. The logic was the tennis courts and pickleball operations play in a very combined space. A lot of interaction there in close proximity, and they touch a common ball repeatedly during that process. Whereas with golf, we have put safeguards in place. You do not touch the pin. You are riding in your cart by yourself unless you're the same family member. Sanitation is able to be used in an effective manner, whereas when people are on courts, that's not the case. You're moving at high speeds, rapid operation, swapping and changing of balls constantly. So it was just a decision made based on that basis to allow one to play versus the court action.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Winston. The next presentation would be from the Ad Hoc Committee on the Asian Carp, and I believe it's Carla that's going to present the update.
Okay, do we have that PowerPoint available for
It's on.
It's on.
those who are viewing to follow along?
It's on the screen.
Perfect. Okay, so I've been serving with the Asian Carp Committee, and just to give you an update, we have information from Mr. Dennis Baxter from TVA. So hopefully we're on that second slide. During the March 2nd meeting, he gave us some important takeaways. And one of those is that there's no evidence of Asian carp successfully spawning upstream of Kentucky Lake since 2015. This fact explains why barriers are being installed in areas where Asian carp have already been found, and that is to slow or halt the migration from the Ohio River. So basically what the TVA is telling us is that if their populations are not increasing due to spawning, then they're increasing due to continued migration. So it does make sense to put those barriers in places, even though carp have already been found in like Kentucky Lake and the Pickwick Reservoir. There are differences between the dams and locks on the Tennessee River compared to the Illinois and Ohio rivers, which impact the effectiveness of various types of barriers, which is why several types are being tested. And those differences, including the differences in depth of the water, inhibit spawning in the Tennessee River. So TVA is completing the environmental assessment studies on all TVA dams simultaneously, which will save time once the initial study is completed. That's one of the things that slows this process down, is that they're required to complete these environmental assessment studies. So they're doing that all at once, so that if they need to do some mitigation in other dams, those studies will already be done when they get to that point. The next slide, Dennis also told us about MICRA, which is the Mississippi Interstate Cooperative Resource Association. That's 28 state agencies with fisheries management jurisdiction in the Mississippi River Basin, and their coordinated efforts with TWRA and TVA. There are ongoing efforts by elected officials. An example that he gave was Senator McConnell and Representative Comer recently got $26 million allocated for the Mississippi River Basin for the Asian carp migration and mitigation efforts. And then he also shared with us the various responsibilities of stakeholders in the efforts to stop the migration and provide mitigation. The states operate the fisheries. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services provide funding and allocation, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates the locks, and the TVA controls the dams and water control. The next slide. The situation here that I need to remedy. Okay, so he gave me an update. All of those things were learned during that March 2nd meeting. So he gave me an update just last week where he explained some ongoing efforts with the TVA in this regard, and that is that Lindsay Gardner of the Tennessee Wildlife Federation facilitates a monthly conference call with TVA, elected officials, and involved governmental agencies to share information and discuss strategy regarding ongoing efforts to slow and stop the Asian carp migration. So I know one concern that some of our property owners have who are really concerned about this migration of Asian carp is that coronavirus has taken the front seat and nobody's paying attention to the Asian carp anymore, and that is not the case. They continue to work on this on an ongoing basis. TVA, based on their testing and studies, considers the leading edge of the Asian carp migration to be Kentucky Lake and Pickwick Reservoir, and they tagged hundreds of fish in Pickwick and then discovered that upstream migration was actually limited and slower than expected, with many of those tagged fish returning downstream to Kentucky Lake. So they were kind of pleasantly surprised about that. And then in March of 2020, TVA thoroughly surveyed Lake Chickamauga in its entirety, and they did not find any Asian carp. And their quote was that doesn't mean necessarily that they're not there, but if they are, that they are relatively scarce. I'm sorry, I'm closing something here so I can see my screen better. I don't know why it's not letting me see this full screen. There we go. Okay, so in addition, TVA is working in conjunction with the Watts Bar Lock to provide a floating barrier. Due to COVID-19, the lock is being used very sparingly because basically commerce and transportation along the river has kind of come to a screeching halt, as it has in most ways in the entire country. So for that reason, it is closed almost all the time. A floating barrier would utilize shocking boats to electrify the water downstream of the lock before it's opened, thereby moving fish back and rendering them immobile during barge transportation through the lock. So that's being discussed and considered between TVA and the Watts Bar authorities. The highest usage of Watts Bar Lock is actually by the Vol Navy, which occurs during the fall and winter. And the Vol Navy, if you're unfamiliar with that, are the people who traveled by boat downtown to watch the Tennessee Volunteers football game. So we're hoping that we have football this fall, but that occurs during the fall and winter. So the Asian carp spawning season is from the end of April through October. And so Mr. Baxter at TVA does not see migration through the locks outside of spawning season as being a likelihood. And that's the spawning season is the most important time they would be on the move. And then the U.S. Geological Service is planning a webinar with TVA in the states of the Mississippi River Valley to provide updated information regarding barrier options. Originally, some of these webinars and WebEx type events were scheduled to be public meetings, but right now we're improvising because we're not able to hold those public meetings. The statement that I received from TVA, and I will tell you that Mr. Baxter sent me this statement. I've been in contact with several people from TVA. They've been really forthcoming with giving us information and sharing what they're doing. They've worked with several people from Tellico Village and from the surrounding area, the Watts Bar folks and all of that. And Dennis Baxter has actually offered to come and be with us during our April 22nd meeting, where he will actually present some updates and let you guys know what's going on. So we'll plan for him to be doing our Asian carp update at the next board meeting on the 22nd. So their statement currently is, TVA is committed to helping stop the spread of silver carp in the Tennessee River and to supporting the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, TWRA, and other states and agencies in a joint effort to fight this invasive species threat. This includes studying the fish's reproduction, its movements in the system, and evaluating the effectiveness of various barriers. Much work is being done. We are seeing good results in our collaborative effort to address this issue. Some of the joint activities either underway or being planned include additional targeted surveys on the Tennessee River, public meetings, exploring funding opportunities, environmental assessments, and testing of new methods to control silver carp. All the partner agencies understand the concerns being voiced and recognize the potential threat posed by silver carp. The good news is that to date, no silver carp have been found by numerous TVA and TWRA fish surveys in the upper Tennessee River. Other agencies have found them in Kentucky and other reservoirs, but silver carp are scarce above the Pickwick area of the Tennessee River. Also in these and other reservoirs, native species such as bass, crappie, bluegill, and others are healthy, strong, and abundant. No adverse impacts or degradation of these species from silver carp have been identified in scientific observations by TVA, TWRA, USGS, and others. So the good news is, so far, so good, and they're working very diligently to continue that story. So I spoke with Dr. Timothy Joseph, who you may remember presented at one of our board meetings earlier this year. He is the founder of the Watts Bar Ecology and Fisheries Council, and he shared with me some information that we're actually following up on with some of our elected officials and agencies, and that is that a temporary electric barrier can actually be placed inside the lock very quickly. And this idea originated with a member of the Roane County Environmental Review Board, John Shaw. In speaking with Smith and Root, who is a contractor who installs electric barriers, a temporary barrier can be installed in about 6 months at a cost of approximately $2 million. Now that's in comparison to perhaps as long as 3 years at a cost of up to $10 million. So that's actually kind of a nice alternative if we can get this going. Approval, funding, and implementation will take some time, of course, in front of the installation. So it's Dr. Joseph's understanding that if a temporary barrier is installed because it is inside the lock, there wouldn't be a requirement for an environmental assessment. If that's the case, then this could mean that the lock could be reopened in less than a year if things are placed on the fast track. One of the things that we are talking with elected officials about now, Dr. Joseph, Keith Sanderson, who's another property owner here in Tellico Village, and myself, we have actually been reaching out to contacting elected officials to say, because of the slowdown of transportation and commerce on the river during this COVID-19, during the controls of COVID-19, wouldn't it be smart, to put some of these projects higher on the priority list and hopefully be able to accomplish something in this regard while that transportation is at a really low level, because then it would really minimize the economic impact of transportation on the Tennessee River while these barriers are being installed. So we're getting some positive responses from them. And of course, nothing committed yet because none of them can make that decision unilaterally. But that is something that we are working on to speed up that process. Ed Carter, who is the executive director of the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, or TWRA, says, as to questions about funding for berries and other preventive measures for Asian carp migration, there's growing support in Congress and some funding has been approved. We don't know ultimately what Tennessee will be allocated, but he thinks it is likely to be less than $1.5 million. On the state side, even with support from some legislators, we did not receive any funding. Therefore, we will continue plans on what we can do through our TWRA Rainy Day Fund, which currently has less than 6 months of operating expenses, and that may be changing rapidly as the COVID-19 controls go on. He said, Ed says that he will continue to explore best avenues to combat the carp. So what that tells us is that we need to make sure that we keep our consistent pressure on, the agencies who have the authority to do some of these things that will help prevent the migration and mitigate it if possible, and make sure that we're asking them to allocate those funds. So now that was just TWRA who thinks that they're going to get the $1.5 million, but it is important for us as the voice of Tellico Village, for all of you guys who are property owners, for all of us who are on the committee and the board, that we continue to contact those officials and continue to put consistent pressure on them to make sure they're paying attention to this issue. On this screen, you'll see that some partner agency links, FAQs, and fact sheets. This is where you can find a lot of great and official and accurate information about this issue. In addition to this, there is a Facebook page, and it's called Stop Asian Carp in Tennessee. And I apologize that I didn't get an opportunity to put this on the slide. We've been, as Rick said, dealing with a few technology issues this morning, so I didn't want to push to the issue. But it is called Stop Asian Carp in Tennessee, and they use the acronym TN for Tennessee. So you can search that on Facebook, where you can see where you can view posts, videos, and photos from those from multiple points of view on this issue who will be impacted by Asian carp. And so that's where we are today. As I mentioned, Mr. Baxter will be here for the next board meeting and give you another update from TVA, and I'm sure things will have changed even in the next 2 weeks. But all of that information will be posted to the website, so you can get those links and you can view some of that information for yourself.
Thank you, Carla.
Does anyone have questions for Carla? Great report, thanks. And I just want to reiterate that just because we're dealing with lots of other issues right now does not mean that we're slacking off on our efforts to control the carp. Okay, with that, we're going to move to our next agenda item, and that item would be one of our advisory committee liaison reports from Andy Fox, representing food service for the first quarter.
Good afternoon. Well, we're going to, we're a few weeks ahead of our normal QBR, but I was able to get all of the clubhouses in except for Kahiti. I have not received Kahiti's P&L yet, but I do have the Yacht Club Toco and Tanasi. I'm sure you guys saw the information I sent out to Shannon on Thursday. So I guess we'll just take it one step at a time. We will talk about the last 3 months and then sort of moving ahead. So you can go right ahead there, Mitzi. We'll start with the Yacht Club. We were off to an absolute rip-roaring start. January was actually the first January in 10 years that I've been here that we actually almost broke even. Typically, we lose about somewhere in the $20,000 range in January. And there's some reasoning for that, which is on the next slide. But we'll go ahead and talk about the quarter, 19 compared to 20. Obviously, this included a couple of weeks in March where we were down considerably right in the middle of the month. But with January and February, we ended up down a little bit in participation, about 1,000, a little over 1,000 folks. Dining room sales were almost even. Catering sales were up. And then as you can see from a sales standpoint, we were about $8,000 in total sales for the first quarter, below last year, same quarter. So we did a pretty good job of coming pretty close. Product cost, we were down almost 11 points. Labor down 6 points. Other expenses down 5 points. So we were able to shave quite a bit of money. Obviously, as you can see, we were about $50-some thousand ahead of last year as far as the subsidy goes. $5,000 in the first quarter as a loss. I don't think, again, in 10 years of doing this, that I've ever seen it less than 35, maybe 40. So an amazing start to the year. Unfortunately, you know, we're in where we are now, but we were off to a rip-roaring start. So on the next page, I sort of explained some of it. You know, this year did include New Year's Eve. Last year did not. That was just a shifting of the schedules. As far as TOQA being up and running, I've divided quite a few of the expenses which Tenacity and the Yacht Club took bigger pieces of last year. Now they're taking smaller pieces. So that's helped greatly, including salaries, which have been split a lot more fairly. Skylar getting his promotion to Director of Ops, his salaries actually split a third between the 3 restaurants, whereas before it was all here. So that's a huge piece as well. So what I challenged the staff with after December, as we were coming into the new year, knowing that January and February are typically pretty slow for us, I challenged them to basically sell off inventories and not buy new products. So we cleared out a lot of the liquor cabinets, we cleared out a lot of the freezers and the coolers, came up with great specials. Quality did not suffer at all, but what did drop considerably, as you saw, was food costs by about 11%. Which is huge. Now, you know, moving as we move into the year, obviously we'll start to repurchase some of that stuff, but we will keep inventories at a much lower level than we have in the past, and we'll try to keep those savings moving forward. And then, as I said in the last line there, sales were down about 30% in March, and that included the 2 weeks of, you know, when this whole pandemic started and people started to, you know, stop coming a little bit. So. And then we'll moving forward. You know, I know you guys are always asking. So we've had actually at this point 5 weddings have canceled is the wrong word, rescheduled. We have moved 4 April weddings and 1 May wedding to future dates. 3 of them have moved to future dates this year. 2 of them are still in limbo, trying to figure out, but they have not canceled. They've just talked to us about the potential of moving forward. We just don't have a date yet. We are assuming that our other couple of weddings that we have in May will do the same. We are hoping, of course, not to lose any of them, just to reschedule them to future Saturdays. Also, this number changed a little bit. I wrote at a current rate, sales and expenses run approximately a $20,000 loss. We're actually, I just did payroll yesterday. We're actually looking at about a $2,000 to $3,000 loss per week right now of what we're doing. So much better than 20. Hopefully, you know, the 4 weeks of April to 8, maybe 12, maybe a $12,000 loss somewhere in there if sales continue to stay at the levels they are now. So not really that bad at all. I do have all of our salaried managers still working, trying to keep that team in place. And I have laid off every single hourly employee that we have, although we are going to bring a few back starting this week, as I have Mary Beth out on FMLA for the next 2 months, having a baby. So I'll be bringing back a few hourlies to work a few hours here and there. And then I added this. I just added this yesterday, so you guys haven't seen this. It is basically just the sales through yesterday of what the Yacht Club, the Snack Shacks, and Kahiti are doing on a daily basis. I know this is kind of small and hard to read, but I get this spreadsheet to Mitzi every day, so you guys can obviously just ask her anytime you want. She can send it to you. But I'm keeping a day-to-day guest counts and sales at all 4 units that we have open right now. So that was it for the yacht club. Should I stop for questions or keep going? So I explained a little bit of this just to give you guys a sort of a rundown of what's going on. I was able to, when we started having these POA meetings back in the middle of March, and with all the information that's out there, and I've been doing quite a bit of reading, I kind of got ahead of the curve. I had all of my employees applying for unemployment basically the beginning of the week of March, around 14th or 15th. So when we did decide to close on the 19th or 20th, most of them had already applied. Therefore, most of them started getting unemployment almost a week after we shut down. So they were in pretty good shape. I did keep all of my salaried managers. They are running all of the operations. We have one floating to Kahiti because Kahiti's been pretty busy. They're running the snack shacks. Then they're coming over here and helping out the yacht club because at about 5 o'clock we get pretty buried. We're keeping the same 5 to 6 o'clock dinner hour. Everybody wants to eat at 5, 6 o'clock, so we got a line of cars outside. So we've got 4 or 5 people here between 4:30, 5 o'clock, and 7 o'clock. The snack shacks are open, weather permitting. When they are closed, and I don't need those managers, I am utilizing vacation days for them. And we're trying to keep our variety as good as we can. We've added some brats. I'm working with Dave. We might get the grill going over at Tokwa to do some burgers. We're really trying to, spice up the menus over there as best we can to up the sales as best we can. Kahiti, of course, is open, as you guys know. So obviously I'm sure there's a question that many of you have in your mind is, how's AWE doing? Are we going to survive this? Just so that you guys are aware, I did lose my business through 9/11. When that happened, I lost my restaurant. So I have spent the last many years in a much more conservative, safe sort of scenario. So I do have a bit of credit. I have been able to boost my cash flow of recent. So we are fine at the moment. I did apply for the Paycheck Protection Loan, although everything's pretty much at a standstill at the moment. A few million people have applied for this, and nobody's gotten any answers on anything. So just kind of waiting and reading, and fingers crossed. That was an old one. You can skip that. Just skip that. I gave you guys a newer one. So Tanasi, we'll run up Tanasi. We're talking about first quarter, 19 through 20. We were down considerably, but we were able to keep our costs for the most part in line. We ended up losing about $14,000 more than we did the year before. We did expect that sales would drop with Tokyo being open, and they did. And moving forward, we do have contracts. We do have things that we have to pay on a monthly basis. We do have health insurance. We do have certain things that continue to have to be paid. So I am looking at somewhere between a $3,000 to $5,000 loss per month, keeping Tanasi closed. And then Tok was similar as far as the loss goes, as far as obviously not having anything in 19 to compare to. Those are the sales for 2020, so $218,000 in quarterly sales, which was about $40,000 more than Tanasi. And then as you guys can see, the product cost and the labor and the loss of about $15,000. So I think that's it in a nutshell. I tried to keep it pretty simple. Figured you guys would have some questions about what's going on and how we're moving forward. So,
Does anybody have any questions for Andy?
okay,
Not hearing any.
all right,
Thank you very much.
awesome. Thank you. Stay safe.
Okay.
Did nobody open this yet?
What?
Need to go get Jared.
Hang on.
She's going to get Jerry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Marty. Did you have a? Andy, don't leave.
Don't leave yet.
I can't hear you.
You gotta mute the.
Okay.
Hang on, Marty.
Ready?
Ready?
Sorry, Andy, this is not for you.
Oh,
Oh,
Sorry. I have one comment back on Carla's presentation.
oh,
The name of the Facebook page is Stop Silver Carp in Tennessee. Okay? And I sent Mitzi a text and she will put that in the minutes. Okay?
okay. Thanks, Marty.
Okay,
we're gonna move to the next.
Who is Jerry Doherty, the chief of the Tellico Village Volunteer Fire Department. So Jerry, the floor is yours.
First thing first. I have basically five.
No, we'll hand you the slides for you.
Basically five big things to bring the board up to date on. One is the preparation for and the ISO audit that took place in Metro. The request for a coordinated plan and approach from within Loudoun County. COVID-19 update. Telco emergency PEMSCON, as we call it. Telco emergency medical systems conditions update for what we're doing. An overview of our new protocol for responses within the Telco Village. And then the future of what's out there for the fire department. And then I'll answer any questions. I saw earlier on your audit, or on your agenda, you had an update for COVID-19. I'd just like to share that back in March, the fire department was asked to do an update. So we met, and not knowing anything about COVID, we really learned very quickly. And in the meantime, all of a sudden I got a phone call from the ISO office down in Chattanooga saying that we're going to come in and do your audit, your annual audit, or 5-year audit. So the ISO audit, just to bring everybody up to speed on what that is, next slide. In the state of Tennessee, all the fire departments are ranked by ISO Insurance Service Office. It's a rating that affects the insurance premiums of all the residents within that area. 10 is the worst, 1 is the best. Tellico Village is at a 4. We were at a 6 before. We moved from 6 to 4 during our last audit. Next. Go ahead. Next. Go ahead real quick. There's basically 3 components. One is the emergency communication system. That's known as the 911 center and how we talk with them and how they dispatch us. The second one is the fire department itself. And that's worth 50 points, and that's basically the people that are in the department, what our capabilities are, what our training is, what the equipment we have, and how we maintain the equipment. And then the last one, the last big one, is the water supply, which is the POA basically, the water main system, the hydrants, and the testing that is done on those. And then there's the fourth component, which is a bonus. It's extra credit for 5.5 points, and that's called community risk reduction. That's if you have a fire prevention type program, smoke detector program. We're looking at, the Tellico Village does not have that and has never had it. We're looking at getting involved with the state of Tennessee to do a smoke detector program for the village. So it uses a 100-point scale with really 105.5 is the total. So we won't know what our results are until June, July, or August timeframe, and that was before the COVID-19 hit. So we got all the information about the fire department on the meeting we had with him on March 10th. He's been over to the 911 center. and we shared the information around the water supply system and the drawings and results of our hydrant testing flows with them also. So he has all the components, he's just got to work through the system. Next. COVID update, as of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, there were 52,874 total tests in the state of Tennessee, 48,736 tested negative, 4,138 tested positive, 408 are hospitalized, and there have been 72 deaths. Loudoun County has 15 positive tests and 176 negative tests. No deaths so far. And our 5 surrounding communities, there's 206 positive, 2,511 negative, and 5 deaths. Knox County is sitting out there with the biggest at 143 positive tests, 1,530 negatives, and 3 deaths. And Blount County has just jumped up to 2 deaths. And I think Knox County is going to jump up another one with us. I heard of another person that my daughter knows. Next. So, as I said, back in March, the leadership team, the 2 chiefs, the 2 deputy chiefs, and their captain sat down together and tried to come up with a plan on how we would operate within Telco Village, given the COVID-19 conditions. So we thought about, okay, we have 2 vehicles. Normally, one's in the north, one's in the south. And when a call comes in, it's an all hands on deck that would respond to it. If the call is in the north vehicle, 122 would respond. If it's in the south, 121 would respond, and all the members in that area would respond. So the request was to make sure you minimize your exposure and maximize the potential of a fire in the future, that you have the personnel to do it. So we developed what at that time was a 5-step plan, and we had the triggers over on the right saying, okay, TEMSCON 5 is going to be our normal. We're going to have 1 rescue vehicle per zone responding and limit the number of responders to 2 people. So that worked for a couple days, and to try to tell a first responder or a firefighter, turn over at night, you don't have to go to a call. It's tough. And we don't want people responding to fire calls and all that, so we really had to do some thinking. So we sat down again. If we go to the next slide, we modified it, and we just went to basically it's showing 4 because we might have to modify it to come back, but right now it's a 3-tier system, TEMSCON 4, 3, and we drop right to a 1. And the trigger is what was to be, if there was a confirmed case in Loudoun County, we would drop up in the readiness plan. And then if we had a confirmed case in the village, we would drop up to the to the number 2 plan. And then if there was a confirmed case of a firefighter, we would go to 1. Not being able to get the information of where the confirmed cases are within the county or within the state, we ended up saying we couldn't do that. We were able to get confirmation that the cases were in Loudoun County, but they couldn't tell us or wouldn't tell us where the cases are. We found out about 3 days later where the first case was, and that may have been a slip of the information, but it shut off immediately after that. But the first case was in Wind River across the lake. But after that, we have heard nothing as far as where the cases are. We petitioned county commissioner, county mayor, our state representative, trying to see if they would loosen up the HIPAA policies and try to just give us some information on if it's in Telco Village, let us know so we could respond accordingly. And the state attorney general said no. This past Thursday, on April 2nd, the state attorney general, along with the Department of Health, finally relaxed the system. And what went into place yesterday in Loudoun County was a memo of understanding with the 911 centers. They're going to be the clearinghouse. They know the locations of the hot houses. basically where a resident confirmed case is located within their jurisdiction. So the 911 center in Loudoun County knows where those cases are. They cannot tell us due to HIPAA. However, what they will do, starting yesterday, if we are dispatched to a call at a certain address, and that address is flagged, they will just advise us that you are responding to a confirmed residence. They will not tell us if it's the husband, the wife, or significant other, whatever, but they will just let us know that we're responding to that house. And it was interesting that Monday night, before this memo of understanding went into play, Lenore City and Loudoun City Fire Departments, they run together on mutual aids. They ran to a fire call, and they had to evacuate an apartment complex, and there was a confirmed case. They didn't know it until the next day. So with that, so where we are right now is that we are at the Thamescon 1. We have one vehicle assigned in the village. It rotates from the north to the south, depending on who the driver was assigned. And we have 2 additional responders responding with their own personal vehicles to all calls in the village. If there's a CPR call, that number would go to 7 within the village. The second vehicle is back at the fire station and available if we have a second call. We would send somebody there, or somebody driving by the station could stop, jump into that vehicle and take it to the next call. But the odds of having 2 calls back to back, we may have had 4 calls last year that were right on top of each other. So that's what led us to 1 vehicle on the road. That'll minimize our exposure to our members as far as the scene. So if you go to the next slide.
So Jerry, basically what you're saying is that you've made the assumption there's cases.
Yes.
And by the way, from a safety standpoint, that's exactly the right move.
I chatted with the mayor and our Henry Cullen, our commissioner, and the assumption was that Telco Village is the second largest population in the county, and if there's 13, 14, 15, 16, whatever the number is, you can only assume that possibly one of those is in the village. We do not know that. So what we have done is we broke the department up into the responders that live in the north, in the south, and then those that we have identified as fire and motor vehicle accidents only. So the group that's in the gray box, they do not respond on any medical calls in the village, even CPRs. We will not be responding to that. Those only in the white area would be responding to medical and CPR calls. For a fire motor vehicle calls, those in the gray area are the ones that are going to be right up front. Those in the white area can come to the scene and be behind and support if necessary and as needed. All members now will be wearing a surgical mask when they respond to a scene. Next. Go ahead. So we've modified working with the 911 center, we've asked them to do some initial queries with the patient and caregivers, and if possible, move the patient to the outdoors so that there's air flowing, so that would reduce the possibility of contamination. The first EMS on the scene is to do a doorway triage, and that's after that we ask 3 questions. Have they been out of the country in the past 30 days? Do they have a cough or sneezing? And do they have a fever? We're going to modify it saying, have they been out of the country, or has anybody visited you from out of state within the past 30 days? Because people from Georgia and Ohio are coming to visit grandma and grandpa, and they might be bringing it in with them. So that's the first thing we do now is a doorway triage. Depending on how the patient or caregiver answers that, if they answer yes, we will drop our bags and back up, and a little bit of show and tell. We have gloves. Everybody will be wearing gloves. We'll either be donning a surgical mask or a N95 mask and face shield. These were made by residents of the village. And lastly, but not in that order, is a blue gown. So they will back out, dress up before they go into the house. So we have the go bag in addition to the orange bag. That is our jump bag and then the medical bag. All right, next. And sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. So when we come out of a scene, all the equipment, all the people go over to the back of the rescue vehicle, and we have sanitizing spray and towels that we wipe down everything, put all the gloves and anything that we wore into a hazardous disposable bag, and then we dispose of it at the proper location. Okay, the future. We can go quick on this one. Just awaiting the results of our ISO audit that took place on the 10th. Continue our daily monitoring. The numbers come out at 3:30 Eastern time normally. Last week, or Monday, it took them a while because the numbers jumped so high over the weekend. It took them a while to get it. So that information comes out early. I was sending out an information to all the members and to the board of directors of the fire department and copying Winston on it as far as what the numbers were, and that was getting a little time consuming for me, and I finally said, here is a website that you can go out and look at, and it clicks. You can just hover over the Loudoun County, it'll tell you all the information about Loudoun County.
What's the
whole state?
Jerry, what's the website?
I can get it for you. I do not have it off the top of my head. Okay. We have learned to become experts in Zoom. We have conducted 5 meetings so far with the membership, and next week we're going to go into training. We're doing the emergency medical responders training. It's a 2-day session, 8 hours each day, so we're going to be Zooming those meetings to do the classroom portion, and then once the pandemic is lessened and we'll be able to do face-to-face, we'll do the hands-off, but everybody will get the classroom portion of it it starts next Saturday and Sunday. We have 4 what we call rookies that you saw on the earlier screen. They were members that just completed their EMR training, but they could not be tested because the testing facilities were closed down by the state. So they're heading up to Johnson City tomorrow. Johnson City is one of the test facilities that is going to be allowed to open. So we have the 4 rookies going up there tomorrow to take their test to become EMRs. Our annual open house, which is normally on the first Saturday in May, has been postponed until October, and it'll be fire prevention week. Whether it's going to be the first Saturday or the last Saturday of that week, we don't know yet, but that's our next plan.
Jerry, I know that when you do your open house, usually that's part of your, capital campaign.
Right.
So are you postponing the capital campaign, or are you?
No, we are continuing we're going to have the mailing coming out. The newsletter we just got that. The Lions will be delivering that out.
Okay.
And then we're going to have that campaign. So we're letting everybody know that we're postponing it, but we're saying we still need the monies, please keep them coming.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's a long readout, but I could. That's the website, yeah. So we could, if you want to pass that on there. So. And then, as I say, back to normal. When is that? The FEMA conference call that we had this morning, they were saying sanitizing, washing hands, and social distancing. That's most likely going to be the normal until July timeframe.
Forget it.
Any
So does
questions?
anybody have any questions for Jerry?
We have a question from YouTube.
Okay.
If you'll repeat the question for the people online.
Okay.
Do you all have a good supply of personal protective equipment?
Yes.
The question that was posed was, does the fire department have an adequate supply of personal protective equipment?
Yeah, we were able to find a source for the N95 mask. That's the most important mask. We were able to find a source for that. We couldn't find a source for surgical masks, but we went out on the neighborhood and we put a request out saying we could use masks, and I think we have 250 of them have been made for us.
Cool.
And then just this past week, someone asked about face shields, and we said we don't have them. And then somebody says, one of the persons on the neighborhood said, I have a 3D printer, let me try something. So far we have 38 of these
Wow.
that have been made. And what it is it's just a piece of clear laminate with the standard 3-hole punch. So that's the disposable part, and that's the part that we can keep.
Wow. Okay.
So right now, provided we don't have an increase in calls and all that stuff, our calls have dropped off. Priority ambulances calls have dropped off. The expected response time for an ambulance may increase these next couple of weeks because of their manpower, because they have dropped off and they have cut back on the number of people that they are having on duty.
Might want to comment, Chief, on the hand sanitizer.
Pardon?
You might want to comment on the hand sanitizer, how much we have. And
Oh, hand sanitizer. We went out and bought some moonshine. It was 100 proof alcohol, and we made our own. We have a 5-gallon bucket of it. And I just found out, working with Summit Physical Therapy, that downtown Loudon, at Lyle, Tate and Lyle, they also have the corn mash that they would be more than happy to share with the fire departments and local departments to make their own if they want.
So you're not going up in the woods and getting it
No,
from
we're
somebody
not-
still, right?
We're buying legal. So.
Any other questions for Jerry? Jerry, I have a question, and I know that you may not have the answer to this, but does the Hopewell Fire Department have similar programs to yours?
They're in a different county, so I don't know.
I understand that.
So I don't know how they're working over in the Blunt, Monroe counties area. We have a conference call once a week with the fire chiefs and the police chiefs and the sheriff with EMA, and we do the planning, so I don't know. I would assume that they are, but I do not know.
Okay. I'm sure that, our neighbors in Kahiti would be very interested in knowing that stuff.
Right.
So, okay, well, thank you so much, Jerry. We do appreciate you taking the time to come over and brief us. Okay, so that brings us down to the last formal agenda item. Obviously, with what's going on in the world, we've had to take another look at what our budget and form contingency plans depending on how long this goes on. And so to address that, oh, hold it, I missed one. I missed one, I'm sorry. The next presentation is really on public works projects. And so Clayton Taylor is going to address those fairly briefly because there's not a lot of change, Clayton.
No, sir.
Okay.
Okay. We first have this, it says, as you will see, some of the updates are mirrored due to the COVID-19. Most companies don't and will not do anything, but conference calls, and we've been doing a bunch of conference calls, emailing them with some of these guys. So, next slide, please. Wellness in the roof, as the slide says, work's been suspended because of the heavy oil canning of the roof. Engineering has been looking at that, trying to determine the cause and the solution to that. Last week, we met with Barge Engineering and Mike Ford. We was up on the roof, doing some tests, looking at some stuff, trying to find some of the problems and solutions.
Can you quickly explain what oil canning was? I've had a number of people to read the telegram and say, what is oil canning?
Instead of the metal laying flat, it's like a bubble would be under it. And it's just where it's not laying flat down on the roof because it's either in a bind or something is pushing it up. So it's just like a bubble in that metal.
And it's not pretty.
And it's not pretty. I
No.
mean, it's functional, but aesthetically it's horrible.
Right. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Next slide. So, this is the same as the last month. Barge Engineering, decided that they weren't a good fit for this project. Mr. Hockey, which is our vice chair of the PSAC committee, has reached out to Jacob Engineering. You know, he has a long relationship with them. So he's reached out to some of the specialists in their organization that deal with docks, floating docks, harbors and stuff, and marinas, and that object and that scope of work, and we will be working with them. They've not felt comfortable coming down and meeting with us, but we are having some email communication and some conference calls with them.
And based on my conversations with the PSAC in the last couple of weeks, the breakwater as
They've not stopped. This virus has not stopped them. They continue to work. At this point, Telco Village has located all of our utilities that they have called in, so they're not waiting on us. So we are staying ahead of them with locations.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Clayton?
Just a comment, Clayton, you might want to mention that this project is not per se a POA project.
Correct. It's not a POA project, but we do locate because we're part of the 811 Tennessee One Call Service.
Yeah, I'd like to bring up too, if you want to catch up on this, go to the most recent Telegram. There's an excellent article in there about what the village and Von Orr and Monroe County folks have done to make this happen.
Cool. Thank you, Clayton. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, Mitzi, let me back up a minute. Can you contact the Hopewell Fire Department and ask them to at least send us some slides to brief us on what their plans are and what
Okay.
they're doing?
I can.
And so now I'll return to what I inadvertently announced prematurely.
Hold on. Steve has a question. Did Clayton leave?
Yeah.
Steve has a
I
question.
can't-
What's his question?
I don't see him on my screen either, and I can't hear him anymore.
Can you turn him on back there, Stephen? Okay, we're ready, Steve.
Can't hear him.
What was this? Is he on mute? There he is.
There he is.
Oh, it's voice activated.
I see his mouth moving, but I can't hear him.
I can't hear him.
Tell him to turn his volume up, somebody.
Steve, are you muted? Well, we're working on fixing this.
You're muted.
Now.
Okay, I got you now. Steve, go ahead and ask your question.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
All right, this is for Clayton. I understand that we have a new project manager from Jacobs on the water tank, a guy named Adam Bard.
Clayton actually has left the room, but that is a true.
Okay, I would like to have Mr. Bard give the board an update at our next meeting on his professional assessment of the project, because I'm hearing he's got some serious concerns with what's been proposed with the water tank, with the pumps and so forth. I'd like to hear personally from him as to what his concerns are.
We'll put it on the next agenda. I don't know. Okay.
All I know is he was rechecking the numbers that Bud had given him before Bud resigned.
Okay. So Parker is going to discuss, we've been engaging in contingency planning because things have changed somewhat dramatically in the last several weeks. And so I will leave it to Parker to explain what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mainly for the benefit of those that might be joining us remotely, I want to make a few introductory comments, and then I'll get to the presentation
I can't hear
slides.
you, Parker. Your mute button must be on.
Can you hear me now? I'm muted now. I was unmuted.
Try it now.
Try it
Okay,
now.
can you hear me now? Okay, I see the remote board members nodding yes.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay? Okay, to start over. Mainly for the benefit of those that are joining this presentation remotely, particularly property owners. In today's issue of the Connection, there's an article that describes some of the things that the POA staff is doing, not only operational adjustments that we're making, but perhaps some comments to put the village at ease that we are taking steps to deal with this crisis so that we can come through it in a financially sound and viable manner. Couple of things to note that first off, we're beginning the year 2020 from a position of financial strength. We finished 2019 with good positive net income and good cash balances. Those cash balances actually have increased during the first quarter. Part of that due to deferment of some projects and expenses, but also revenue continued to come in good form during the first quarter. So we're starting into the second quarter with good cash levels and the ability to manage through this. I also note that much of our revenue is relatively stable and not directly or immediately affected by the coronavirus crisis. Over half of our revenue comes from assessments, some 52%. Water, sewer, and tank installations account for almost a fourth, 24%, and docks and RVs, another 4%. Most of that has already been paid for the full year. So over 80% of our revenue is highly stable and not subject to day-to-day changes in the environment. I'll point out that one of the larger variables in this actually is golf revenue. Golf is budgeted at something like 12 to 13% of total revenue for the year. But since we've been able to adjust and keep the golf courses open by allowing electronic registration and payment for your golf rounds, you can continue to play golf even though the doors to the pro shops may be closed. It's important that we keep this revenue stream going, and if one thing Tellico Village residents have proven in this last few weeks, if the sun is shining and the weather is nice, you will come out and play golf, and we encourage you to continue to do that. So with those introductory comments, the board challenged the financial organization and the department division heads to look at our operations and begin developing contingency plans to look at the what ifs. What if various things happen that affect revenue? What can we do to control costs? What can we do to stage and gate the timing of capital and major maintenance expenditures? So we did indeed do that, and I'll be discussing what's called Scenario 1, and it's numbered because we have and will look at additional cases, but this is the one that seems to be, I won't say most likely, but it's a reasonable case to look at for the next several months. First and foremost, we started with the department and division heads and asked them what projects or expenditures, maintenance or otherwise in their operations, what things could they defer either until later in the year or possibly even into next year. Things that could be done later but without compromising current operational capabilities. And so they developed a lengthy list. I'll go over some pieces of that here in a moment. Secondly, we assumed that the governor's safe at home order would continue. We're assuming for this case at least, that it continues on into the summer. Scenario 1 assumes safe at home approach continues through July of 2020. We incorporated the staff recommended deferrals of capital and expense items, and they're substantial. But again, these things we think can be done without compromising today's operations. There had been planned a 3% merit increase for staff salaries, was to have been effective April the 1st, and we have deferred that not only for these budgets, but we have deferred that in actual practice execution until July 1st. And we'll revisit that later on in the year and determine whether that's appropriate to implement at that time. And with no retroactive pay adjustments coming back to the 1st of April. New home starts, we budgeted for 120 home starts in the year 2020. For this exercise, we've reduced that number to 49. And I'll say right up front, having reviewed some of the data through the end of March, it appears that that number is extremely conservative. Scenario 1 includes 49 housing starts, but already year to date through the end of March, we have 47 housing starts already approved. And there are 8 more to be brought before the Architectural Control Committee. Either have already been brought in their first meeting of April or will be brought forth in the second meeting. So the assumption built into this scenario of 49 is on the ultra conservative side. Essentially, we've already beat that. Property transfer fees, we assumed would halt for 90 days and then resume at decreased rates. Again, we've not seen this actually play out yet. It's an assumption for planning purposes, but property continues to sell and continues to transfer, at least to this point. Now, one of the reasons that new home construction volume and new home permits is important is that new tank installations, sewer tank installations, follow along with new home permits. And likewise, connection fees for water and sewer services follow new home construction. So that revenue and that funding of the water and sewer reserve is dampened in this scenario 1 look. This case assumes that food service shuts down through the month of July. Certainly the jury is still out on that as to when they can restart, but for the moment and for the coming months, food services clearly has taken a big hit, and one that we're maintaining food service on a carry-out basis at the Yacht Club in Kahiti. I'd encourage you to support those. It makes a big difference in their ability to continue to operate during this time and come out well on the other side. One of the elements that we also looked at concerned delinquent assessed lots. And for this case, we built in an increase in the number of delinquencies of 300. Again, having looked at recent data, I think that number is very conservative, that is on the high side, but that's what we've built into this evaluation. For the year 2020, we budgeted 185 delinquencies. That was where we were back in late summer and early fall when we were putting the budget together. Currently, through the end of March, we're at 169 delinquencies, individual lot delinquencies. So we're better than budget through the end of the first quarter. We have not seen a spike in delinquencies since this crisis hit, but we have built in a conservative, I think, assumption that there would be as many as 300 additional lots go into delinquency through the rest of the year. We did not take any staff reductions during this time. We have had some reductions in staffing, however, as some staff have been allowed to use either sick leave for a small period of time or have worked reduced hours. Some of our staff are working partly in the office and partly at home, doing the essential elements of the job and keeping the business going. And some of our temporary and seasonal staff decided to take some time off from those obligations, and so that element of staffing has indeed been reduced, but no permanent full-time staff reductions as part of this plan. We built in a 25% reduction in golf rounds through the end of July. If first quarter experience is any harbinger of things to come, golf is off to a good start in the first quarter. Yet we did build in a 25% reduction in golf rounds through part of the peak golf season. Recreation does take a big hit in that rec facilities are closed. We are not billing recreation fees for monthly or 6-month and annual memberships. And those that had memberships already in place, we have notified them that we will extend their memberships at the end of that term to compensate them for the time that rec facilities are closed. So that revenue will be recognized as a loss in revenue starting with the month of March and continuing until rec facilities can reopen. Likewise, the yacht club subsidy, we have built in subsidies for an additional 4 months of loss, and then, we'll see what happens at that point. Starting from a position of financial strength not only happened at the end of the year 2019 and the beginning of 2020. I don't have final financial results for the month of March and first quarter yet, but I do know that through the end of February, we were well ahead of budget, better than budget, over $500,000. And the indications I'm getting just prior to release of March financials is that we beat budget in the month of March as well. So my point here is we are not going to have to climb out of a hole that we dug during the first quarter. In fact, if anything, the first quarter put us in better shape to weather this storm and come out once the clouds have cleared. So that's a little bit of the background as to assumptions and how we got to this stage. On the next slide, which I know is too small print for you to read either in the room or remotely, but I'll try to hit the highlights. In the first column, we identified capital that could be deferred even into next year. And that capital totals $1,268,000. So almost $1.3 million capital can be deferred. $500,000 of that is the water tank. It would actually straddle the year 2020 and 2021. $500,000 this year, another $500,000 next year. The breakwater at the Yacht Club Basin, $220,000. We think that can be deferred at least into the beginning of 21. We will have some additional professional studies and evaluations done of that facility to make sure that it doesn't have to be moved back up. Yacht Club first floor renovations, $110,000 is on the deferral list, and also $115,000 for Tokwa fairway mowers. Maintenance, we have almost $1.5 million of projects that can be deferred. We would like to do some of these this year, but if push comes to shove, these things could be pushed into 2021. Far and away the biggest of those projects is the HA5 pavement preservation work, just under $1 million. And the second largest project is coating the wet wells at one of our sewer lift stations, $114,000. That will receive further engineering evaluation to determine if that's prudent to put that off or if it indeed needs to be done now. And in addition to that, there was just over $200,000 in other expenses that were identified as costs that could be saved or eliminated by passing on some things like training, travel, some golf maintenance. Seasonal staff has been delayed. Let's see, the deferred salary increase, we've already talked about that one. Anyway, all of that added up to over $200,000. So all in, we've got about $3 million that we have some discretion over timing, at least, projects that we ultimately believe need to be done and will be done. They just don't need to be done as originally planned. So having taken that into account, Shannon, if you'd move on to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. This does have an impact on the profit and loss statement. And you would think perhaps that with the crisis going on in the COVID-19 situation, that we would begin to see, even with these steps taken, begin to see that bleed over into our financial statements. Certainly it will have an impact for all the reasons I just mentioned. But if we look at scenario one for the full year, net income actually increases. Now you think that's counterintuitive. How can net income go up in a period of crisis like we're dealing with? Well, it goes up because of the deferrals, particularly the maintenance deferrals. So, and the cost savings, those two things combined. Now, there are some other costs that we incur and revenue that we lose, but if you only had to look at the year 2020, you would think, well, this is not too bad, we can get through this in good shape. That would be flawed thinking, however, because those things that get deferred from this year into next ultimately need to be done, and they need to be paid for in the next year. So what we did, we looked at not only the original budget for 2020, but we also looked out into 2021 and looked at a combined 20/21 24-month period. Shannon, if you'll move on to that next slide, please. The one that says original budget. Thank you. Okay, so this starts with about $2 million operating cash as of the beginning of 2020. We had budgeted for net income of $668,000 this year and another $1.1 million next year. So total combined, almost $1.8 million for the 2 years. Depreciation likewise is shown at $1.8 and $2.1 million respectively. We had a capital plan of $2.8 million this year and another $1.6 million next year, so total of about $4.5 million. We have cash going into reserves and coming out of reserves, and so total reserves actually build up in the budget year. Now you'll see that's not quite as rosy when we get to looking at the contingency case. So looking at the contingency scenario one, the year 2020 net income actually goes up, as I previously mentioned, by some $600,000, but in 21 it comes back down by $1,300,000. If you look at the 2 years combined, net income drops by just over $700,000. Likewise, because capital projects get capitalized later in the year, you don't take as much depreciation on those projects, and depreciation comes down by $159,000. Cash going to reserves. For the 2-year time period, that drops by about $400,000. That's primarily due to lower water and sewer connections and tank installations, and more delinquencies in terms of generating the assessment revenue. But again, I'll point out those water and sewer connections are dependent upon housing starts, and we've got some fairly conservative assumptions, I think, built into this model. The cash coming back from reserves, however, is virtually unchanged for the 2-year time period. So in the budget model, we needed $6 million back from reserves, and that's still about what we would do, given that all this done is pushes projects from 20 to 21, but we ultimately do them a year later and draw against reserves to fund that. Likewise, because cash stays in the bank longer by deferring some of the capital and maintenance projects, we actually have an increase in interest income, about $57,000. And for 2020, the capital spend drops by 1.3 million, and in 2021, it increases by 1.3 million. So capital spending for the 2-year combined time period is essentially unchanged. Now, that's a lot of stuff going into the mix. The only way to sort all of that out is to run the budget model and do some analysis against that. And the net of all that indicated that for 2020, scenario 1 actually ends the year with $1.8 million more cash than was budgeted. Now, much of that cash ends up in reserves for reserve funds that are not tapped to pay for projects executed in 2020. In 21, however, and looking at the 2 years combined, this scenario results in lower total cash balances of $880,000. Still, we finish 2021 just under $4 million total cash, combined operating cash and reserve funds. So I think the end conclusion of all this, this is in some ways, it's a conservative view, even at this level of operations and this level of revenues and expenses. We've deferred those items that we reasonably can without compromising operations. Yes, we will take a hit, particularly in rec and food services, but the rest of our revenue, we are certainly hopeful that we can get through this in pretty good shape. That's especially true if we can keep our golf courses open and keep good weather so that golfers can continue to play. That's where I conclude these comments. I'll be happy to take questions either from the board or if we have some coming in from the audience listening at home.
I do have an audience question for Nikki Vaughn. Parker, to repeat the question, I have two. First question, not able to see the forecast. I'm assuming that it is done on a cash basis. Can you please confirm?
Okay, the income statements are done on an accrual basis. For the accountants in the audience, you know what that means. It basically means that we recognize revenues and expenses as incurred, but not necessarily as paid as the cash goes out the door. We make up for this in the cash flow statements, which are done on a cash basis, so that by the time we get to the end of the cash flow statement, we can tell not just the impact on the P&L, but the impact on our cash balances overall. So it's a blend of the two. It's accrual accounting on the income statements and cash on the cash flow statements.
All right, second question. Do any of the proposed maintenance deferrals put us in a medium, high-risk position if not done?
That question, that's really the way the question was staged and presented.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, the question was, do any of the projects, maintenance projects particularly, or capital, put us at risk for things that are not being done that really should be done and done now rather than later? I think that's the gist of the question. And the answer is, that's exactly the way we posed this exercise to the department heads, which was to come forth with capital and maintenance projects that, in their judgment, could be deferred without compromising current operations or putting us in dire straits. Now, having said that, the wave attenuator will receive some additional study and engineering views. The sewer wet wells likewise will receive additional studies and engineering opinions. We've had some discussion even as recently as today as to what to do regarding road maintenance. We don't have to make all of these decisions today. What we are doing is deciding to defer, at least for a few months, making these decisions, and then we'll revisit this again. So just because HA5 in this scenario 1 was pushed out to 2021, we will revisit that in a couple of months, see where we stand financially and otherwise, and determine whether some, if not all of that, should continue and be done in 2020. So I think we're taking a reasonable, cautious view, but prudent view toward doing those things that need to be done right now, but holding off on those things that we can defer. Even defer decisions for a couple of months will help.
Parker, if I can add to that, I think we learned our lesson back in 2009 that just taking stuff that is required maintenance off the table is never the right thing to do. So when we had our discussions at the board level, we basically were saying we need to revisit this short term. We don't know how long this is going to last. And if somehow we come out of this by June, most of this will get all turned back on.
Parker.
Good points. And just the fact that we can kind of buy a couple of months right now, that gives us not only the time to build up these cash balances and fund even more money into reserves while not pulling money out of reserves, but it gives us a chance to kind of better see how this is going to play out and see prudently what we can turn back on and when.
Bruce?
Yeah, Parker, you might want to mention that we've already awarded the contracts for the HA5 work. It's just on hold. So we're in a position to turn that back on should the finances turn out that we're capable of doing it and need to do it this year.
Excellent point. I presume Bruce's comments came through.
So Beth, are there any other questions from outside? Are there any more questions from the board?
Winston?
Parker, is it safe to say that on your plan, scenario 1, revenue down by 1.8 million, lost revenue with your assumptions?
That's not all lost revenue. It is,
Just looking at your scenario 1 PL impact.
I tend to look more at net income rather than revenue per se. Okay, Winston's correct that total revenue is down $1.7 million, but there are also some costs that drop as well. In fact, the cost in 2020 dropped more than the revenue, and then recovers in 21. Now, all that said, cash ends up some $800,000 lower at the end of all this than it otherwise would have.
You said Steve had a question?
Do? Can you hear me?
Yes. Say yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Parker, well, this is for the board, Rick. I believe in 2 weeks when we meet, the board needs to review the forecasted additional cash loss of $150,000 from the food service out of the yacht club and Kahiti to determine if we want to continue to have that cash bleed going on, or do we need to stop that cash bleed to supplement this cash loss that we're experiencing. So I think we need to put that on the agenda for formal discussion in 2 weeks.
Fine.
Fair enough.
Fair.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, so that takes us to the end of our agenda where we have other. Is there any other topics from the board? And not hearing any. Not hearing any, I guess, do I have a motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn. Second.
I second it.
We're adjourned. Thank you for putting up with this. It's been an experience.